Our group researched the relationship between GDP per capita and the child mortality rate. For the first 50 years, child mortality in all countries remains relatively unchanged. This is because medical technology is so primitive that even the wealthiest countries are unable to use it effectively. Around 1850, however, you can see that the countries with the largest GDP per capita began to improve their child mortality rate, mostly wealthy European countries and the United States. This trend of only wealthier countries showing substantial improvement continues until around 1950. At this point, all the countries begin a downward trend of child mortality.
Worldwide, the first downward trend in child mortality began in the turn of the century. The CDC reports that 30% of all newborns died before their first birthday. Efforts to decrease child mortality in Western countries started with improvements to urban households. Pasteurization of milk, first adopted in Chicago in 1908, saw a decrease of milk-borne disease and gastrointestinal infections. Europe adopted the same practices and soon saw a decrease among urban newborns.
In economics, an idea known as the catch-up effect, or convergence, is the general idea that poor economies' per capita incomes will increase at a higher rate than countries with richer economies. In turn, all nations' economies will eventually converge at similar points within time. In the 1900s, countries with higher GDP per capita, which mainly includes countries in the Americas and Europe, showed the highest increase in income up until the 1970s. After these years, the rate of income increase diminished. Countries with lower GDP per capita, mainly Asian and African countries, showed little to no increase in income up until the 1970s. After this time, the income rate skyrocketed all the way until the 2000s, where they began to stabilize with the rest of the world. A similar catch-up effect can be seen in the infant mortality rate. After technology is improved in more developed countries, it moves to less developed ones and becomes easier for the less developed countries to improve child mortality rate, despite lower average income. We will now look at two specific countries with two different economic and medical histories, the United States and Malawi.
The United States was among the first to see improvements in its child mortality rate. This was due to the previously mentioned increased hygiene in urban areas due to the creation of several government agencies, including the Children's Bureau, which promoted such efforts. The government ensured that pregnant women saw doctors for prenatal, natal, and postpartum care. Such extensive welfare is expensive and requires enough income to be taxed within a country. During the 30s and 40s, discoveries of antibiotics such as penicillin saved millions of lives. Such antibiotics still have not completely saturated countries where patients do not have the income to afford them. The later trends in the United States come from specialized equipment for unusual cases, such as respiratory systems for premature births. This technology is only available in well-equipped hospitals.
Malawi, a small nation in the southeast region of Africa, lags behind the U.S. in both gross domestic product and quality of healthcare. We notice that data on child mortality in the African nation does not exist until 1950, so before 1950 it is an estimate from Gapminder. With development of Africa from Europe after World War II, we see an increase in the income of Malawi, coupled with a slight decrease in child mortality. By 1974, Malawi's child mortality rate decreased at the highest rate of change seen to that date. 1980s brought economic downturn after economic downturn, yet as the access to the Western world and improvements in Western technology trickled down to Malawi, their child mortality ticked downwards. Still not as low as the US, not as wealthy as the US, Malawi saw a dramatic decrease in their child mortality rate as their economy developed. As technology and economic development from the first world found its way to the developing world, the child mortality rate decreased.
And increased income gives people access to more and better technology and medicine, and this is what reduces the child mortality rate. More efforts to make these things available to people without means would be the best way to prevent child deaths around the globe.